March 6, 1944. 25,000 feet above Berlin, Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke pulls his Messerschmitt Bf-109 into a climbing turn, scanning the sky through a canopy streaked with oil and frost. Below, the Reich capital sprawls beneath a thin veil of industrial haze. Above, contrails etch white lines against the pale winter blue. He counts them. Dozens of American bombers, B-17 flying fortresses in their tight defensive boxes, droning toward their targets with mechanical inevitability. He's done this before. Many times. The tactics are familiar. Wait for the escorts to turn back, then strike from the sun when the bombers are alone and vulnerable. The Americans always come deep and their fighters always leave them. It's simply mathematics, fuel capacity, range, the tyranny of distance. But today, something is wrong. The escorts aren't turning back. Knoke keys his radio, voice tight. Achtung, Jäger, amerikanische Jäger über Berlin, American fighters. Over Berlin, it shouldn't be possible. His eyes track the unfamiliar silhouettes, sleek, predatory, utterly wrong in this sky. They circle the bomber formations like wolves protecting the herd, their silver fuselages catching the cold morning light. In that moment, Heinz Knoke understands. The rules have changed, the sanctuary is gone, and the war in the air will never be the same. To understand the shock that rippled through the Luftwaffe that March morning, you must first understand what came before. The air war over Europe had been building for years, a brutal calculus of altitude, firepower, and range that favored the defender at every turn. It began with a doctrine. In 1942, the United States Army Air Forces committed to a strategy that many considered suicidal: daylight precision bombing. While the British Royal Air Force had shifted to night raids after devastating daytime losses, the Americans insisted their heavily armed B-17 and B-24 bombers could fight their way to targets in broad daylight, strike with accuracy, and return home. The theory was elegant. The flying fortress bristled with 50 caliber machine guns, up to 13 per aircraft. Flying in tight combat box formations, these bombers could create overlapping fields of fire so deadly that enemy fighters would be shredded before they could press an attack. The theory died over. Schweinfurt, August 17, 1943. The first Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. 376 bombers penetrated deep into Germany to strike ball-bearing plants critical to Nazi war production. They went without fighter escort for most of the journey. The Luftwaffe fell upon them in waves, Bf-109s, FW-190s, even twin-engine Bf-110 destroyers firing rockets into the formations. 60 bombers never returned. 60. A loss rate of 16% in a single day. The Americans tried again. October 14, 1943, Black Thursday. The second Schweinfurt raid. This time 291 bombers set out. 60 were shot down. 17 more were damaged beyond repair. 38 others returned with battle damage. Nearly 600 airmen were dead, wounded, or prisoners. The cost was unsustainable. The problem was simple and insurmountable. Range. American fighter escorts could only go so far before their fuel forced them to turn back. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a magnificent fighter, rugged and powerful, could escort bombers approximately 475 miles from base with external tanks. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design, could reach slightly farther. But Germany's industrial heartland lay 600, 700, 800 miles deep. Berlin sat 1,100 miles from English airfields. For hundreds of miles, the bombers flew alone. The Luftwaffe had learned to wait. German fighter controllers tracked the American formations from the moment they crossed the coast. They watched the escorts on their radar, calculated fuel states, anticipated the moment of separation. Then they pounced. Staffels of fighters gathered at assembly points, building mass waiting for that inevitable moment when the Thunderbolts waggled their wings in farewell and peeled away for home. What followed was slaughter. Luftwaffe pilots developed tactics specifically for attacking the unescorted heavies, head-on passes from 12 o'clock high, closing at a combined speed of 600 miles per hour, firing into the cockpit and engines before breaking away beneath the formation. Attacks from 6 o'clock low, sliding into the bomber's blind spot below the tail. Sturmbach units, assault groups equipped with heavily armored FW-190s carrying 30mm cannons, closed to point-blank range, absorbing punishment to deliver killing blows. The Americans bled. In the autumn of 1943, average bomber loss rates exceeded 5% per mission. Crews were required to complete 25 missions for a combat tour. The mathematics were grim. At 5% losses, fewer than 1 in 4 crews would survive their tour. Some bomber groups lost aircraft faster than replacements could arrive. 8th Air Force Commander General Ira Eaker faced an impossible choice: continue the campaign and watch his force bleed to death, or admit the daylight bombing doctrine had failed, abandon precision strikes and cede the moral high ground of accurate bombing to the British night offensive. There had to be another way. There had to be a fighter that could go the distance all the way to Berlin and back, with fuel to fight when it got there. Most aviation experts believed such an aircraft was technically impossible. The physics simply didn't work. A fighter needed speed, maneuverability, firepower, and range. You could have 3, but not all 4. They were wrong. The solution came from an unlikely source and almost didn't happen at all. In 1940, the British Purchasing Commission arrived in the United States desperate for aircraft. The Royal Air Force was bleeding fighters over France and the Channel, and British factories couldn't produce Spitfires fast enough. They approached North American Aviation with a request: build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license. The company's chief designer, James Dutch Kindleberger, made an audacious counteroffer. Give us 120 days, he said, and we'll design you something better. The result was the NA-73X, the aircraft that would become the P-51 Mustang. The early Mustangs were exceptional at low altitude. Sleek, fast, and aerodynamically refined, they excelled in ground attack and reconnaissance roles. But above 15,000 feet, their Allison V-1710 engines gasped for air. They couldn't compete with German fighters in the high-altitude arena where bomber escorts operated. The RAF relegated them to tactical roles. The U.S. Army Air Forces showed little interest. Then someone had an idea that changed everything. Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang in April 1942 and immediately recognized its potential. The airframe was brilliant, it just needed a different engine. What if they replaced the Allison with a Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered the Spitfire? The Merlin's 2-stage supercharger maintained power at high altitude. Mated to the Mustang's low-drag airframe, it might create something extraordinary. The first Merlin-powered Mustang flew in October 1942. The transformation was stunning. Top speed increased from 390 mph to 440 mph. Service ceiling jumped from 31,000 feet to 41,900 feet. But the most revolutionary characteristic was range. The Mustang's laminar flow wing wasn't just aerodynamically efficient, it had internal volume for fuel tanks. With internal tanks carrying 269 gallons, the P-51B could fly 600 miles. Add 2 108-gallon drop tanks and the range extended to an unbelievable 1,300 miles. For the first time, an aircraft existed that could escort bombers to any target in Germany and return with performance to match, or exceed any fighter the Luftwaffe could field. But bureaucracy nearly killed it. The U.S. Army Air Forces had invested heavily in the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning. Production lines were established. Tactics were developed. Changing horses mid-war seemed risky. Some commanders doubted the Mustang's fragile-looking design. Unlike the rugged Thunderbolt with its massive radial engine and heavy firepower, the Mustang appeared delicate. Its liquid-cooled engine was vulnerable to ground fire. Early models suffered from technical problems, gun jamming at high altitude, propeller issues, and quality control concerns from rushed production. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, finally forced the issue. By late 1943, with bomber losses mounting and public support for daylight bombing eroding, he demanded the Mustang be prioritized for escort duty. Production accelerated. The P-51B and P-51C variants began arriving in England in November 1943. Assigned to the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustang Group. The Luftwaffe had no idea what was coming. German fighter pilots had grown accustomed to a certain rhythm in the air war. They knew the American escort's limitations intimately. They'd learned to recognize the moment when Thunderbolts and Lightnings reached their maximum range. The formations loosening, the fighters circling nervously, checking fuel gauges, finally turning west with visible reluctance. That moment was the Luftwaffe's advantage. Everything beyond that invisible line in the sky belonged to Germany. The defensive system the Luftwaffe had built was formidable. Freya and Würzburg radar stations tracked incoming raids from the coast. Fighter controllers vectored interceptors to assembly points. Experienced Jagdflieger, fighter pilots, many with scores of victories, knew exactly how to exploit the bomber's vulnerabilities. They understood crew fatigue, knew which formations had the most discipline, recognized when bomber pilots were inexperienced. More importantly, they controlled the geography. German fighters could take off, climb to altitude, engage, land, refuel, and attack again, sometimes flying 3 or 4 sorties against a single raid. American fighters, bound by fuel calculations and the tyranny of distance, fought with their eyes constantly on their gauges, always calculating reserves for the long flight home over hostile territory and cold water. Berlin itself had never seen American fighters. It remained beyond reach, a symbolic sanctuary. The Reich capital had suffered British night raids, but the idea of American fighters escorting daylight bombers over the city seemed physically impossible. Luftwaffe pilots based around Berlin had fought hard battles, but always with the advantage of position. They attacked bomber formations already battered by earlier interceptions, crews already exhausted by hours of flak and fighter attacks. That was the world as it existed through the winter of 1944. The Americans were brave, their bombers tough, their crews determined, but the arithmetic favored Germany. The sky had depth and the Luftwaffe controlled everything beyond escort range. Then the Mustangs arrived in force, and the arithmetic changed overnight. Angle 1. The pilot's perspective. Put yourself in the cockpit of Heinz Knoke that March morning. You've been fighting since 1940. You've seen France fall, flown over England during the Battle of Britain, watched the Eastern Front consume thousands of aircraft and pilots. You've survived when so many haven't. You know the bombers are coming. You can hear the controllers on the radio, tracking the raid as it crosses Holland, calculating altitude and heading. You know the American escorts will turn back somewhere over Western Germany. They always do. It's not cowardice. It's physics. You taxi out, check your guns, climb through the thin cirrus layer. The morning sun is cold and white. Your breath fogs the canopy until the heater catches up. You form up with your staffel. 8 aircraft, half what you'd have had a year ago. Everyone else is gone. Dead, wounded, transferred east. You're flying with teenagers now. Boys with 30 hours in type, kids who've never fired their guns in anger. Then you see them. Silver glints at high altitude. Escort fighters weaving above the bombers. You check your watch, calculate the distance from England. They should be leaving. They should be gone by now. But they're not. They're staying. And then you see more fighters. A second wave, fresh and aggressive. Moving ahead of the bombers in a fighter sweep. Hunting. The voice on your radio belongs to someone you trained with. Someone who's been flying combat as long as you have. His transmission is clipped, professional, but you hear something underneath it. Disbelief, perhaps even fear. They're not turning back. The Mustangs, they're staying with the bombers. You push your throttle forward anyway. You have orders. You have duty. But something fundamental has shifted in your gut. The sanctuary is broken. If American fighters can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. There is nowhere left to run, nowhere left to rest. The mathematics that kept you alive, the calculated risk. The moment of opportunity when the escorts departed no longer applies. For the first time, you fight in your own sky without advantage. Angle 2. The technological marvel, the P-51 Mustang, was an aircraft that shouldn't have existed. It violated the conventional wisdom of fighter design. Every engineer understood the trade-off. Long range required fuel, fuel added weight, weight reduced performance. You could build a long-range escort, but it would be a lumbering target for nimble interceptors. You could build a high-performance fighter, but it would burn fuel so quickly it could barely leave base. The Mustang somehow escaped this trap. The key was the laminar flow wing designed by Edgar Schmood and his team at North American Aviation. Unlike conventional wings that created turbulent airflow, the Mustang's wing maintained smooth laminar flow over a greater percentage of its surface. This reduced drag by as much as 30% at cruise speeds. Less drag meant better fuel efficiency. Better efficiency meant range without penalty. But the wing alone wasn't enough. The real transformation came from the Packard-built Merlin VD1650 engine, an American-manufactured version of the British Rolls-Royce Merlin 61. This engine featured a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger that maintained sea-level atmospheric pressure in the cylinders up to 30,000 feet. The Mustang could cruise at 362 mph at 25,000 feet, faster than most fighters' maximum speed, while sipping fuel at economical settings. Then came the drop tanks. Two 108-gallon paper and metal tanks hung beneath the wings, extending range to 2,300 miles. The pilot could jettison them before combat, fighting clean with full internal fuel. The Germans had drop tanks too, but nothing on this scale. Nothing that transformed the strategic equation so completely. The armament was brutal in its simplicity. 6 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, 3 per wing, with 400 rounds per inboard gun and 270 for the others. Total, 1,980 rounds. The 50-caliber round was devastating, large enough to tear through airframes, puncture fuel tanks, shred control surfaces, yet with enough ammunition capacity for sustained engagement. German fighters typically carried 20mm or 30mm cannons with far fewer rounds. Accuracy mattered more for them. The Mustang pilot could afford to miss. The cockpit offered visibility that German pilots envied. The Malcolm hood, a bubble canopy adopted from late 1943 onward, gave the pilot nearly 360-degree vision. No blind spots, no surprises. In a dogfight where seeing the enemy first often meant survival, this was gold. Speed, range, firepower, visibility, and maneuverability. The Mustang delivered all 5. It could escort bombers to Berlin, fight at altitude against the best the Luftwaffe had, and still have fuel to strafe targets on the way home. The Germans had nothing to match it. Angle 3. The tactical shift. The arrival of the Mustang changed more than capabilities. It changed philosophy. Before March 1944, fighter escort was purely defensive. Thunderbolts and Lightnings stayed close to the bomber formations, reacting to German attacks, trading altitude for position to intercept incoming fighters. It was exhausting, reactive work. The Luftwaffe chose when and where to engage. American escorts responded. The Mustang's range freed American fighters from this defensive straitjacket. Fighter groups could now push ahead of the bomber stream in offensive sweeps, hunting German fighters before they assembled into attack formations. Instead of waiting for the Luftwaffe to gather strength at designated assembly points, Mustangs could hit them on the climb, scattered and vulnerable. The predator became prey. General Jimmy Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, understood this immediately. He issued new orders. Fighter pilots were to pursue and destroy German aircraft aggressively, even if it meant leaving the bombers temporarily. The goal wasn't just protecting the bombers, it was destroying the Luftwaffe itself. Attrition warfare. Hunt them in the air, strafe them on the ground, give them no rest, no sanctuary, no moment to rebuild. This was psychological warfare as much as tactical. German fighter pilots had always controlled the tempo of battle. They chose when to engage based on tactical advantage: altitude, sun position, fuel state, numerical superiority. Now they fought on American terms. Mustangs appeared everywhere, above, below, ahead, behind. German pilots climbed from their airfields directly into combat, with no time to organize, no opportunity to assess the situation. The stress was unbearable. Luftwaffe pilots flew 3-4 sorties a day, each one a life-or-death scramble. They landed with empty guns and nearly empty tanks, mechanics swarming to rearm and refuel while the pilot tried to eat, tried to breathe, tried to stop shaking. Then the sirens again. More bombers. More Mustangs. There was no rest. No respite. The Americans came every day the weather allowed, sometimes twice a day, grinding the Luftwaffe down through pure relentless pressure. Angle 4. The psychological impact. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin shattered something deeper than tactical advantage. It broke a promise the Nazi leadership had made to the German people. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal and commander of the Luftwaffe, had famously declared in 1939 that if enemy aircraft ever reached the Ruhr, the German people could call him Meyer, a common Jewish surname. Intended as a humiliating bet he was certain he'd never lose. Later, as Allied bombing intensified, he promised Berlin would remain untouchable. The capital of the Reich, the seat of Hitler's power, would stay beyond the enemy's reach. March 6, 1944, made Göring a liar. German civilians looked up that day and saw silver American fighters escorting bombers over their capital in broad daylight. The contrails wrote a message across the sky that no propaganda could erase. We can reach you anywhere. You are not safe. Your leadership cannot protect you. For Luftwaffe pilots, the psychological toll was even more immediate and personal. These were men who'd fought since the war's beginning, who'd seen the Luftwaffe dominate the skies over Poland, France, and the Low Countries. They remembered when German fighters ruled European airspace, when the sight of Messerschmitts meant Allied bombers turned for home. Now the tables had turned completely. Günther Rall, a Luftwaffe ace with 275 victories, later described the feeling. We saw our world collapsing. When the American fighters appeared over Berlin, we knew it was the beginning of the end. Another pilot, Johannes Steinhoff, wrote of the absolute despair when he realized the escorts weren't leaving, that every mission now meant fighting outnumbered over his own homeland. The attrition was murderous. Experienced pilots, men with hundreds of hours, dozens of kills, tactical knowledge earned through years of combat, were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Luftwaffe's training program, once the world's finest, had collapsed under the pressure of constant combat and fuel shortages. New pilots arrived at frontline units with perhaps 100 hours total flight time, maybe 20 in their fighter type. They'd never practiced gunnery against maneuvering targets, never learned energy tactics or situational awareness. They died in their first or second mission. The veterans knew what was happening. They watched teenagers climb into cockpits, saw the fear and excitement in their eyes, gave them whatever quick advice they could. Keep your head moving. Don't fixate on one target. Watch your fuel. Then they watched those same boys fail to return. Sometimes they saw it happen. A new pilot fixating on a bomber, boring in straight and level, not seeing the Mustang diving from above. A flash, smoke, pieces falling. By spring 1944, the Luftwaffe was a force in terminal decline. Not from lack of aircraft. German factories were still producing fighters in huge numbers. But from lack of pilots, lack of fuel for training, lack of time to rebuild shattered units, and increasingly from lack of hope. Angle 5. The American Gamble. The decision to fully commit to the Mustang was not unanimous. It was a calculated risk that could have failed spectacularly. In late 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt was the workhorse of the 8th Air Force fighter groups. Pilots loved it. The Jug could absorb tremendous punishment. Its air-cooled radial engine kept running even with cylinders shot away. It could outdive anything in the sky. Its 850 caliber guns delivered withering firepower. Thunderbolt pilots had developed tactics and confidence in their aircraft. Switching to the Mustang meant retraining, new maintenance procedures, different tactics. The liquid-cooled Merlin engine was vulnerable. A single bullet in the coolant system meant inevitable engine failure. Early P-51Bs had problems. Guns jammed at high altitude due to inadequate heating. The K-14 gun sight had teething issues. Some pilots returned from missions frustrated, their guns frozen, opportunities missed. There were accidents. Pilots transitioning from Thunderbolts misjudged the Mustang's different handling characteristics. Some crashed on landing, unfamiliar with the longer, more streamlined fuselage. Others overstressed the airframe in combat, not yet understanding its limits. But the men who mastered it became believers. Don Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, flew a borrowed Mustang on a mission in November 1943 and immediately began campaigning to re-equip his entire group. He bypassed official channels, made personal appeals, leveraged every contact he had. By March 1944, the 4th was flying Mustangs exclusively. The gamble paid off because of the pilots themselves. Men like George Preddy, who would become the top Mustang ace in Europe with 26.83 victories, like Leonard Kit Carson, Chuck Yeager, John Meyer, pilots who understood that the Mustang's range and performance gave them offensive options the Thunderbolt never could. They learned to fight differently. Instead of defensive circles, they used the Mustang's speed and climb rate for slashing attacks. They exploited its range to pursue damaged German fighters all the way back to their bases. They developed fluid tactics, two-ship elements with mutual support, constant movement, aggression tempered by discipline. The American training pipeline delivered these pilots steadily. Not as experienced as pre-war Luftwaffe aces perhaps, but competent, well-trained, and numerous. Most importantly, they learned from combat. The ones who survived their first 5 missions usually survived their next 20. They passed lessons to new arrivals. They developed institutional knowledge. This was the American advantage, not just better aircraft, but a system that could sustain losses, absorb new pilots, and maintain effectiveness. The Luftwaffe had individual brilliance, aces with staggering scores. The Americans had depth, angle 6. The human cost behind every statistic lived a person. Behind every victory, a death. Consider Oberleutnant Egon Mayer, commander of 3 JG-2, one of the Luftwaffe's most innovative tacticians. He'd pioneered the head-on attack against American bombers, recognizing that the B-17's nose had fewer defensive guns than its tail. His method saved countless German pilots by allowing quick, deadly passes that minimized exposure to return fire. By early 1944, Mayer had 102 victories. March 2, 1944, 4 days before the first Mustang mission to Berlin, Mayer led his Gruppe against a bomber formation near Montmédy, France. Mustangs from the 487th Fighter Squadron intervened. In the ensuing dogfight, 2nd Lieutenant William T. Wisner caught Mayer's Bf-109 in a climbing turn. A 3-second burst, Mayer's aircraft rolled inverted and plunged into the ground. One of Germany's finest tacticians, dead at 28. His experience, his knowledge, his leadership, irreplaceable, or consider the American perspective. Lieutenant Robert H. Johnson, flying a P-47 Thunderbolt, was hit by German cannon fire over France in June 1943. Half his fuselage was torn away. His cockpit was exposed. He had no radios, minimal controls, wounds bleeding into his flight suit. He flew his shattered aircraft 200 miles across the channel and landed it at his base. He survived because the Thunderbolt was nearly indestructible. A Mustang pilot with similar damage would likely have died. The liquid-cooled engine, once hit, gave you minutes at best. Minutes to cross enemy territory, evade fighters, hope your engine kept running long enough to reach friendly lines, or bail out over territory where locals might hide you, instead of turning you over to the Gestapo. The bomber crews saw the Mustangs as salvation. To a B-17 waist gunner, freezing at 25,000 feet in an aircraft that shuddered with every flak burst, watching German fighters assemble for another pass. Seeing those sleek silver Mustangs appear was like witnessing angels. Bomber crew survival rates improved dramatically once Mustang escort became routine. Men who'd resigned themselves to death started believing they might actually complete their tours. The cost to both sides was staggering. Between January and April 1944, the 8th Air Force lost nearly 1,000 bombers. The Luftwaffe lost over 2,200 fighters and 800 pilots killed, including many of their most experienced leaders. These weren't just numbers. They were husbands, brothers, sons. They were men who'd trained together, fought together, trusted each other with their lives. War is the aggregation of individual tragedies wrapped in the language of strategy. The calendar marked it as early March 1944, but for the men who lived through it, the distinction between days blurred into one continuous crucible of fire and altitude. March 3, 1944, the first major test over 700 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, launched against targets in Berlin. It was the first large-scale American daylight raid on the Reich capital. The bombers came in waves, their contrails marking the sky like chalk lines on a blackboard. For the first time, substantial numbers of P-51 Mustangs flew deep escort, though not all the way to the target. Weather was terrible. Cloud cover obscured Berlin itself. Many bombers had to hit secondary targets or bring their bombs home. But the Luftwaffe rose to meet them. Over 160 German fighters engaged the formations. The fighting was savage, confused, scattered across hundreds of miles of German airspace. Bomber crews reported swarms of FW-190s and Bf-109s, some making conventional attacks, others firing rockets from beyond defensive gun range. The sky became a churning hell of tracer fire, exploding aircraft, men falling through thin air toward a frozen earth miles below. 69 bombers went down. The loss rate was crushing, roughly 9%. But something was different this time. The Mustangs claimed 82 German aircraft destroyed. The ratio was shifting. For every bomber lost, the Luftwaffe was losing more than one fighter, and more critically, more pilots it couldn't replace. The Germans understood immediately what was happening. Radio intercepts from that day, captured the desperation in Luftwaffe communications. Controllers vectored fighters to intercept points, only to have those fighters report American escorts still present, still aggressive. One pilot transmitted, "Mustangs at 8,000 meters heading east with the bombers. They're not leaving." Another voice, tight with stress, "Request permission to break off. Fuel critical, multiple bandits." The transmission ended. Whether he made it home, no one recorded. March 4, 1944. The weather cleared slightly. The Americans came again. This time, 730 bombers targeted Berlin and other sites. The escort was stronger, over 800 fighters, including increasing numbers of P-51s. The Mustang groups had learned from the previous mission. They flew in relay formations, one group peeling off as another arrived, maintaining continuous coverage. They pushed ahead of the bomber stream in fighter sweeps, engaging German formations before they could organize mass attacks. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard of the 356th Fighter Squadron found himself alone over Oschersleben when his flight was separated. Below, he saw Bf-110 twin-engine destroyers moving to attack a box of B-17s. Howard dove. For more than 30 minutes, he fought alone against more than 30 German fighters. He made pass after pass, breaking up attack formations, forcing the Germans to engage him instead of the bombers. He shot down at least 4 confirmed, damaged others, expended all his ammunition, then continued making dry runs, fake attacks, to keep the Germans defensive. His Mustang took hits. Hydraulic fluid streamed from punctures. His propeller was damaged. He kept fighting until other American fighters arrived. Howard nursed his crippled aircraft back to England. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive it for aerial combat. But his individual heroism wasn't the story. The story was that a single Mustang pilot could stay in the fight that long, that deep, and still have fuel to return. March 6, 1944. The day Heinz Knoke saw the future over Berlin. 72 bombers launched against the capital, escorted by 801 fighters. The weather was clear, bitterly cold but clear. Perfect visibility, the kind of day where bomber crews could actually see their targets, and fighters could see each other from miles away. The Mustangs went all the way. For the first time, American single-engine fighters escorted bombers directly over Berlin, engaged in combat over the city itself, and fought all the way back to the coast. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was devastating. Pilots who'd believed Berlin was beyond reach, who'd thought they'd always have sanctuary over their own capital, now fought with American fighters circling overhead like hawks. The combat was intense and personal. At 25,000 feet, the air is so thin that every breath must be deliberate, every movement calculated to conserve oxygen and energy. But adrenaline makes you forget. Your heart pounds. Your vision narrows. You pull G's in a turn and blood drains from your head, gray creeping into your peripheral vision. You ease the stick forward, blood rushes back, your sight clears. You see the enemy fighter sliding through your gun sight. You press the trigger. The aircraft shudders as 6 guns fire in unison. Tracers arc across space. You see impacts, flashes on his wing, pieces flying off. He rolls inverted and dives. You're tempted to follow, but your element leader's voice crackles in your headset. Don't chase. Stay with me. Check 6. You resist the hunter's instinct, force your head on a swivel, scanning for threats. Another Bf-109 flashes past, 50 yards away, too fast for a shot. The sky is full of them. Enemies, friendlies, bombers trailing smoke. Parachutes blossoming white against the cold blue. Hauptmann Hans-Joachim Hajo Hermann, a Luftwaffe bomber pilot who'd transitioned to fighters, was flying that day. His post-war memoir described the scene. We climbed through scattered clouds, expecting the usual pattern. Escort fighters at the penetration point, possibly to the German border. Then we'd have the bombers to ourselves. But they were everywhere, over Hanover, over Brunswick, over Berlin itself. Silver Mustangs weaving through the formations, hunting. I saw 3 of our aircraft go down in as many minutes. None of the pilots got out. The numbers from March 6 tell the strategic story. 69 bombers lost, but the Luftwaffe suffered catastrophic pilot casualties. Experienced staffel leaders, men with multiple combat tours, were killed or wounded. Aircraft could be replaced. The factories were still producing fighters in quantity. But pilots? There was no training pipeline that could replace tactical experience, no classroom that taught the instinct that kept you alive. The Americans lost pilots too. 11 Mustangs went down that day, but 11 American fighter pilots represented a percentage loss the 8th Air Force could absorb. Those pilots were replaced within days by fresh graduates from training schools in Arizona, Texas, California, schools that were graduating hundreds of pilots monthly. The attrition mathematics had reversed. Germany was losing the war of replacement. The week that followed became known as Big Week, though it spanned 9 days, not 7, and redefined what was possible in strategic air warfare. February 20th through February 25, 1944. Operation Argument. The 8th Air Force, joined by the 15th Air Force attacking from Italy, launched the largest coordinated air offensive against the German aircraft industry yet attempted. Over 3,800 heavy bomber sorties, escorted by 3,673 fighter sorties. The objective wasn't subtle: destroy the Luftwaffe's means of production and force its fighters into combat where they could be destroyed. The weather had been the limiting factor all winter. Heavy cloud cover over Europe prevented visual bombing, but a high-pressure system finally moved in, bringing clear skies from England to Poland. General Karl Spaatz, commanding U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, seized the opportunity. Every available bomber, every escort fighter, everything went. February 20th, Day 1. Over 1,000 bombers hit 12 aircraft plants across Germany. Mustangs ranged ahead in fighter sweeps, hitting Luftwaffe airfields during morning takeoffs. Major James Howard, the same pilot who'd fought alone over Oschersleben, led his squadron in a low-level strafing attack on a German airfield near Leipzig. They caught fighters on the ground during refueling. Aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip. The destruction was total. Flames and black smoke boiled into the morning sky. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had. JG-1, JG-3, JG-11, JG-26, every fighter wing within range. They climbed through the contrails, oxygen masks freezing in the 40-degree F temperatures, eyes scanning for the bomber formations. What they found instead were Mustangs waiting for them. The dogfights erupted across 3 countries simultaneously. Over Brunswick, Captain Donald Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group engaged a staffel of Bf-109s climbing toward the bombers. He dropped his external tanks, pushed his throttle to war emergency power, and dove. His wingman, Lieutenant John Godfrey, stayed glued to his wing. They tore through the German formation, Gentile's guns hammering a 109 that rolled inverted and fell away trailing debris. Godfrey got another. The German formation scattered, their coordinated attack broken before it began. Over Tutau, Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan led the 353rd Fighter Group's Mustangs in a battle against FW-190s that lasted 40 minutes. The combat started at 28,000 feet and descended in a spiraling brawl down to the deck, aircraft racing between trees, pulling impossible turns just feet above frozen fields. Duncan shot down 3 aircraft. His group claimed 17 for the loss of 2 pilots. The bomber formations pressed onto their targets. Flak bursts created black puffballs across the sky, thousands of them so dense that pilots said you could walk on them. B-17s shuddered through the barrages, bomb bay doors opening, bombardiers hunched over their Norden sights. Bombs fell. Factories exploded. Entire city blocks disappeared in flames and debris. 21 bombers were lost that first day. Given the scale of the operation, it was nearly miraculous. The escorts had worked. February 21st. The Americans came back. Another 924 bombers. The Luftwaffe, still reeling from the previous day's losses, struggled to mount coordinated defenses. Pilots flew who should have been resting. Aircraft flew with mechanical problems that should have grounded them. Desperation was setting in. Over Brunswick, a group of JG-11 intercepted a B-17 formation without fighter escort. The Mustangs were engaged elsewhere. They made their attacks, traditional tactics, closing from astern. They shot down 8 bombers. Then the Mustangs arrived. Within 5 minutes, the German formation was destroyed. 12 Bf-109s went down. Only 3 German pilots bailed out successfully. The escorts weren't just defending anymore. They were hunting with predatory efficiency. February 22nd. Weather forced a pause. The bombers stayed grounded. But the fighting wasn't over. Photo reconnaissance Mustangs ranged over Germany, their cameras recording the damage, identifying new targets, mapping Luftwaffe dispositions. Even in the pause, the pressure continued. February 24th, the largest single strike of Big Week. Over 1,100 bombers escorted by nearly 900 fighters. The targets included Schweinfurt, the same ball-bearing complex that had cost so many bombers in 1943. This time was different. The Mustangs cleared the approaches. Only 11 bombers were lost from over 1,000 dispatched. The cost to the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. 46 fighters destroyed in the air, dozens more damaged beyond repair, but the real devastation was in the cockpits. Oberleutnant Anton Hackel, a 123 Victory ace, was wounded and bailed out over Bavaria. Hauptmann Werner Goerth, commander of IJG-3, was shot down and killed by a Mustang near Halberstadt. Mayor Günther Specht, Commodore of JG-11, took a burst of .50 caliber fire through his cockpit. His aircraft went in inverted. No parachute. These weren't just names in a loss register. They were the men who trained the next generation, who understood how to lead formations, who knew when to press an attack and when to break off. Every experienced pilot lost meant 10 new pilots would die who might have survived with proper leadership. February 25th, the final day of Big Week. Another 1-200 bomber sorties. By now, the Luftwaffe was fractured. Radio intercepts revealed confusion. Controllers unable to vector fighters effectively. Units reporting they couldn't get airborne due to aircraft damage or pilot shortages. The once formidable defensive system was breaking down under sustained pressure. Captain Clarence "Bud" Anderson, flying with the 357th Fighter Group, described it in his combat report. We swept ahead of the bombers at 27,000 feet. Expected heavy fighter opposition. Found scattered groups, no coordination. Engaged 2 Bf-109s west of Berlin. They didn't fight aggressively. Seemed more interested in escaping than engaging. Shot one down, damaged the second. Observed multiple shoots. Couldn't tell if they were ours or theirs. Sky was full of wreckage. The statistical summary of Big Week told a strategic story with brutal clarity. The 8th and 15th Air Forces flew 3,800 heavy bomber sorties and 3,673 fighter sorties. They dropped over 10,000 tons of bombs on aircraft plants, ball-bearing factories, and related industrial targets. American losses: 226 bombers, 28 fighters. Roughly 2,600 American airmen killed, wounded, or captured. But the Luftwaffe lost between 450 and 500 fighters destroyed. The exact number was never confirmed because record-keeping collapsed under the chaos. More importantly, they lost nearly 300 pilots killed or seriously wounded, 18% of their single-engine fighter pilot force. Gone in 6 days. The German aircraft industry, despite the bombing, would actually increase production over the following months. Fritz Tott's dispersal programs, Albert Speer's organizational efficiency, and desperate measures kept fighters rolling off assembly lines. But production meant nothing without pilots to fly them. The Luftwaffe began pulling pilots from training schools before they'd completed their programs. Experienced bomber pilots were transitioned to fighters with minimal retraining. Men who'd been instructors, who'd survived years of combat and earned rest positions, were pushed back into frontline units. None of it was enough. The Mustang had achieved what no aircraft before it could: strategic reach with tactical dominance. It could go anywhere over Europe, fight on equal or better terms with any German fighter, and bring its pilots home. The mathematics of attrition now favored the Allies overwhelmingly. By the end of March 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost air superiority over Germany. They could still mount local defenses, still shoot down bombers, still kill Allied pilots, but they could no longer prevent the Americans from striking any target. At any time in daylight with impunity, the sky over Europe, for 4 years dominated by the Luftwaffe, now belonged to the Silver Mustangs and the men who flew them. The immediate consequences manifested in numbers that told a story of strategic collapse. In January 1944, before the arrival of P-51 Mustangs in force, the 8th Air Force lost an average of 5.1% of bombers dispatched per mission. By April, that rate had dropped to 3.9%. By June, it fell to 2.7%. The mathematics of survival had transformed. A crew member's odds of completing a 25-mission tour, once barely 1 in 4, now approached 1 in 2. For the men flying those missions, this wasn't abstract statistics. It was breathing room. It was hope. Technical Sergeant Robert O'Hearn, a ball turret gunner on a B-17 named Blonde Bomber, flew his first mission in February 1944. He watched 2 aircraft from his squadron go down over Brunswick, saw parachutes fail to open, counted the fighters swarming like wolves. His second mission was worse. Flak over Frankfurt tore the nose off the lead bomber in his element. It dropped out of formation like a stone. He flew 6 more missions in March, each one a battle for survival. Then the Mustangs arrived in strength. O'Hearn's diary entry from April 8, 1944. Little friends everywhere today. Silver P-51s above, below, alongside. German fighters tried to get through, but the Mustangs were on them instantly. We made it to target and back without a single ship lost from our group. First time in 2 months. Boys are actually joking at debriefing. Haven't heard that in a while. This psychological shift rippled through the bomber force. Crews who'd been flying with resignation, certain they'd eventually be killed, only uncertain about which mission would be their last, began to believe they might actually survive. Morale improved. Combat effectiveness increased. Crews stayed focused on their bombing runs instead of fixating on fighter attacks. Accuracy improved, but for the Luftwaffe, the inverse occurred. The attrition from Big Week and the sustained escort missions that followed created a death spiral from which there was no recovery. Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, general of the fighter arm, reported to Hermann Göring in late March that the fighter force had suffered losses from which it could not recover. "We have lost over 1,000 pilots in the last 4 months," Galland stated in a meeting documented in Luftwaffe records. More than 400 of them in the last 60 days alone. These are not just pilots. They are our formation leaders, our experienced Staffelkapitans, the men who train others. We can build fighters faster than ever, but we cannot build pilots. Göring, facing Hitler's increasing rage over the bombing campaign, demanded the impossible. More fighters, more aggressive tactics, better performance. He blamed the pilots themselves, questioned their courage, accused them of cowardice. Galland, a decorated fighter ace with 104 victories, barely controlled his fury at the accusation. The pilots were dying because they were fighting an impossible battle against overwhelming odds. The fundamental problem was mathematical and irreversible. The Luftwaffe needed to destroy American bombers faster than American industry could replace them. But every bomber required multiple fighter attacks to shoot down. The B-17 and B-24 were incredibly tough. Each attack exposed the German fighter to defensive fire from the bomber and to American escorts. The exchange rate was brutally unfavorable. To shoot down one B-17, the Luftwaffe typically lost 2 to 3 fighters, sometimes more. The Americans could replace both the bomber and its crew within weeks. Germany could replace the fighter, but the pilot took months to train, and there was no longer time for proper training. New pilots arriving at JG-3 in April 1944 had an average of 110 hours total flight time. 20 of those hours were in the Bf-109. They'd never practiced formation flying under combat conditions, never fired their guns at a maneuvering target, never learned energy management in a dogfight. They'd read about these things. They'd attended lectures. Then they were strapped into fighters and sent against American pilots with 300-plus hours and experienced veterans flying Mustangs who knew every trick in the book. The results were predictable. Average life expectancy for a new Luftwaffe pilot in April 1944 was 7 missions. 7. Some didn't survive their first. Others made it to 10 or 12, gaining skill and confidence, then died to a Mustang they never saw coming. Diving from the sun, a 3-second burst, moving on to the next target. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots understood they were watching their force die. Johannes Steinhoff, an ace with over 170 victories, later wrote, "By April, we knew we'd lost. The Americans owned the sky. They came when they wanted, struck what they wanted, and there was nothing we could do to stop them. We fought because we were ordered to, because our comrades were still up there, because Germany was still being bombed. But we knew. The Mustangs had broken us. The German high command made desperate tactical adjustments. They concentrated fighters at specific points, attempting to mass overwhelming force against single bomber formations. This sometimes worked. A groupie of 50 or 60 fighters could still inflict terrible damage if they caught a formation before escorts arrived. But it meant leaving other formations undefended. And the Mustangs learned to anticipate these concentrations, arriving just as the Germans committed to their attacks. They tried new weapons. The R-4M rocket, a simple unguided projectile that could be fired in salvos from 400 yards. When they worked, they were devastating. A single salvo could shred a bomber's wing, but they required the fighter to fly straight and level for several seconds while aiming and firing. An eternity in combat, an invitation for Mustang pilots to line up their shot. They tried heavily armored FW-190 Sternbach units, aircraft carrying 30mm cannons and extra armor plating, designed to absorb punishment while closing to point-blank range. These units had success when they reached the bombers, but the added weight made them vulnerable to Mustangs. They couldn't dogfight. They couldn't escape. They either broke through to the bombers or they died trying. Nothing worked. Every tactical innovation, every desperate measure bought time but couldn't reverse the fundamental equation. The Americans had longer-range fighters, more pilots, better training, superior logistics, and the strategic initiative. They chose when to fight. They chose where to fight. The Luftwaffe could only react. By May 1944, with the Normandy invasion looming, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of the force that had dominated European skies in 1940. On paper, they still had over 2,500 single-engine fighters assigned to Reich defense. In reality, perhaps half were operational at any given time. Of those, maybe a third were flown by pilots with sufficient experience to survive more than a few missions. The rest were victims in training, waiting for their turn to die. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. Over 11,000 Allied aircraft participated in Operation Overlord. Fighters, bombers, transports, reconnaissance planes. They flew 14,674 sorties on D-Day itself. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300 sorties total. Allied troops landing on the beaches fought under complete air superiority. German reinforcements attempting to move to the front were strafed and bombed relentlessly. Entire panzer divisions became trapped in daylight, unable to move without inviting annihilation from the air. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France, had warned Hitler months earlier, "The enemy has complete command of the air. If we cannot achieve air superiority, the invasion cannot be stopped." He was right. The air battle had been decided over Germany in March and April, not over France in June. The P-51 Mustang had made this possible. By systematically destroying the Luftwaffe's fighter force, not just its aircraft but its irreplaceable pilots, the Mustang had created conditions for invasion. Allied planners had estimated they needed 3-to-1 air superiority for the landings to succeed. They achieved something closer to 30-to-1. The strategic impact extended beyond tactical air support. The destruction of the Luftwaffe freed Allied bombers to focus on other targets: oil refineries, transportation networks, synthetic fuel plants. By autumn 1944, German fuel production had collapsed. The Luftwaffe had fighters but insufficient fuel to train pilots or mount effective operations. Panzer divisions sat immobilized for lack of gasoline. The entire German war machine ground slowly to a halt. Starved of the petroleum that modern mechanized warfare demanded, Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, wrote in his memoirs that the American air campaign directly caused the end of the war. Not immediately. Germany would fight for another year. But the systematic destruction of fuel production, enabled by the air superiority the Mustangs established, created conditions Germany could not overcome. The numbers tell the story of systematic annihilation. From January through December 1944, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 18,800 fighter pilots killed, missing, or wounded. This represented multiple times the number of pilots they'd started the year with. They were forced to cannibalize training units, pull instructor pilots back to combat, and reduce training hours to dangerously inadequate levels. Production of fighters actually increased throughout 1944, a testament to German industrial organization and Speer's dispersal programs. They built over 25,000 single-engine fighters that year, but pilot production couldn't keep pace. By late 1944, hundreds of brand-new Bf-109s and FW-190s sat on airfields across Germany, pristine and unflyable for lack of trained pilots and fuel. The few remaining Luftwaffe aces racked up staggering scores. Erich Hartmann would end the war with 352 victories, almost all on the Eastern Front where Soviet aircraft and pilots were less formidable than American opposition. But individual brilliance couldn't compensate for systemic collapse. Germany needed squadrons of competent pilots, not handfuls of aces. For Allied fighter pilots, the summer and autumn of 1944 became a period of aerial dominance unprecedented in modern warfare. Mustang groups ranged freely over Germany, strafing trains, attacking airfields, engaging any Luftwaffe aircraft foolish enough to take off. The risk had shifted. German pilots now faced the same terrible odds American bomber crews had faced in 1943, an assumption that survival was unlikely, that each mission brought you closer to death. The accounts from this period reveal the psychological toll on both sides. Captain Don Gentile, one of the top American aces with 21.83 aerial victories, was killed in January 1951, testing an aircraft, having survived the war, only to die in peacetime. But during his combat tour, his letters reveal the strange mix of exhilaration and horror that combat flying produced. "We hunt them like game," he wrote in July 1944. "They scatter when we appear. Sometimes I feel like a bully. Then I remember what they did to the bombers before we arrived, and I pressed the trigger without hesitation." German accounts from the same period are darker. Heinz Knoke, the pilot who'd seen Mustangs over Berlin that March morning, survived the war. His diary entries from late 1944 show progressive despair. "We cannot win. We cannot even fight effectively. We take off. We are engaged immediately by swarms of American fighters. We run for our lives if we're lucky. Most of us aren't lucky." By the time the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, Germany's last major offensive, the Luftwaffe could barely contest the air. On December 16th, the offensive opened under heavy fog that grounded Allied aircraft. For a few days, German armored columns advanced without air interference. Then the weather cleared. American fighters appeared in overwhelming numbers. P-51s, P-47s, P-38s, all of them, hunting freely, destroying anything that moved. The offensive collapsed, not just because of ground resistance, but because German forces couldn't maneuver or supply themselves under constant air attack. The Mustang's legacy extends far beyond World War II. It established principles that define air superiority doctrine to this day. Range enables strategic options, pilot training determines outcomes more than aircraft performance, and sustained attrition warfare works if you can replace losses faster than your enemy. The aircraft itself remained in service for decades. South Korea flew Mustangs in combat during the Korean War. The Israeli Air Force used them in 1948. Private collectors still fly restored P-51s today. Beautiful, dangerous, a reminder of a time when aluminum and courage decided the fate of nations. But the real legacy isn't the aircraft, it's what it achieved. The P-51 Mustang broke the Luftwaffe. It made strategic bombing viable. It created the conditions for D-Day. It shortened the war, saving countless lives, both Allied soldiers, who would have died in prolonged fighting, and German civilians who suffered under the bombing that the Mustang escorts enabled. The question that haunted Luftwaffe commanders in their post-war accounts was simple. Could they have stopped it? Could different tactics, different prioritization, different decisions have prevented the collapse? Adolf Galland, writing in 1953, concluded they couldn't have. Once the Mustang appeared in numbers over Germany, the outcome was decided. We could delay, we could make them pay, but we couldn't stop them. The mathematics were impossible. They had more of everything. More aircraft, more pilots, more fuel, more time to train, more capacity to absorb losses. And they had the range to bring all of it to bear over our homeland. The silver aircraft that stunned Heinz Knoke over Berlin that March morning weren't just fighters. They were the visible manifestation of American industrial might, logistical capability, and strategic reach. They were the moment the Luftwaffe's fate was sealed. Not through a single catastrophic defeat, but through the steady, relentless grinding down of an opponent who could no longer replace what he lost. The sky over Germany, once defended with skill and determination, became an American highway. And the men who flew those silver Mustangs owned it completely. There's a photograph taken in April 1945. A P-51 Mustang sits on a captured German airfield, its silver skin gleaming in the spring sunlight. Behind it, rows of Bf-109s and FW-190s sit abandoned, functional aircraft with empty fuel tanks and no pilots to fly them. The image captures everything about how the air war ended, not with a final climactic battle, but with exhaustion, attrition, and the simple mathematics of replacement. The German pilots who were stunned by Mustang escorts over Berlin weren't witnessing a single tactical defeat. They were witnessing the end of an era. For 4 years, the Luftwaffe had been among the most formidable air forces in history. They developed tactics, trained exceptional pilots, and fought with skill and courage. But courage cannot overcome industrial capacity. Skill cannot defeat numbers when the gap is too wide, and determination cannot create fuel or pilots when both are exhausted. The P-51 Mustang didn't win the war alone. No single weapon system ever does. But it created the conditions under which victory became inevitable. It turned strategic bombing from a costly gamble into an effective campaign. It made D-Day possible. It freed the Allied air forces to dismantle the infrastructure that sustained the German war machine. It did what no other fighter could. It went anywhere, fought anyone, and came home. For the men who flew them, the Mustangs were deliverance. For the men who faced them, they were doom written in silver against the sky. And for history, they remain a reminder that technological advantage, properly applied at the decisive moment, can change everything. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. By then, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The sky over Germany belonged entirely to the Allies. And somewhere in the wreckage of the Third Reich, Heinz Knoke's prophecy from that March morning had come true. The rules had changed. The sanctuary was gone, and nothing would ever be the same.